Okay, so we're on to Acts chapter 9, the famous Saul of Tarsus road to Damascus conversion story claim. So the beginning of 9 continues from chapter 8 when Saul was the Antichrist persecuting the church. So he was breathing murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. And he went to the high priest and asked for letters, warrants to the synagogues in Damascus, authorizing him to arrest anyone he might find, whether men or women. I find it interesting that Luke even specifies that he was arresting women too. Like he didn't discriminate. He persecuted both men and women. Interesting. He didn't leave women out, He never really thought too fondly of women anyway, telling them to shut up in church and let the husbands be submit to their husbands. But, that's another point. But anyway, he was an equal opportunity persecutor. He wasn't chauvinistic. So he went to the high priest. Now, consider this. The priesthood was run by the Sadducees. Paul was a Pharisee. The Pharisees and Sadducees didn't really get along too kosher. And so I find it odd. Even Rabbi Michael Skobach, one of my favorite rabbis, he brought this to my attention, that a Sadducean high priest would go into some illegal business with a Pharisee. It's very unlikely. Not saying it's impossible, but it just seems unlikely. Anyway, the high priest at that time, that was 37 AD. The road to Damascus account took place according to the chronology in the book of Acts. And so the high priest at that time would have to be, Okay, so I was looking for the name of the high priest in 37 AD, and it would have to be either Jonathan ben Ananus or Theophilus ben Ananus. Many people speculate Theophilus ben Ananus was the same Theophilus that Luke wrote to in the book of Acts and the book of Luke, but it's not. I mean, I've checked historical records and I don't agree with that interpretation. But those are the two high priests that straddled the year 37 AD. And so I checked Josephus's works and other historical records to see if there were any mention by either of those two high priests of any illegal dealings with Saul of Tarsus, and there's nothing in any historical records. So that's why I find it hard to believe that a high priest would go into business to do something illegal as to give Saul of Tarsus, that was his name at the time, of course. He wasn't using Paul until Acts 13, and I'll tell you why he changed his name. He had both names, but why Luke started using Paul from Acts 13 forward. But for now, why the high priest would go into an illegal business, a terroristic business of kidnapping foreigners in a foreign country, Syria, Damascus, where a high priest in Jerusalem has no jurisdiction. And if anyone finds out that the high priest was in on it, the high priest could have been killed. He could have been capital punishment, killed for doing something illegal like that, unethical, illegal, and so forth. Because these were citizens of a foreign country, Damascus, Syria. And so a foreign government, that's like an act of war. You going into a next person's country to kidnap Syrian citizens, Syrian Christian citizens, and take them back to Jerusalem. So why would a high priest even put it in writing that he gives permission for Saul to do that. That is ludicrous. That's like the Navy SEAL Team 6 going to capture or kill Osama bin Laden, and they put it in writing in case the helicopter gets, shot down. Everybody could see what their mission is. And besides, the governor Aretas, the governor of Damascus, when he found out that that's what Saul of Tarsus was up to, he wanted to capture Saul. He wanted to capture him, put him on trial, kill him for even doing that. So that's an illegal operation that no high priest would have sanctioned. That's why I question the validity of that claim, which Saul made in chapters 9-22 before the mob in the Sanhedrin, and he made it in 9 to Luke, and also in 26 before Governor Felix. So he made the claim, but it's just hard to believe. Anyway, so he wanted to bring them back to Jerusalem. On the road nearing Damascus, suddenly there was a light from heaven, flashed around him, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you keep persecuting me?" And Saul says, Lord, which is the Greek word kurios, K-U-R-I-O-S, which means, it can mean God, it can mean master, it can mean sir, it's Mr. People Trinitarians especially, like to assume when Saul said, Kurios, who are you? He was automatically referring to Jesus as God, because the same word used for Jesus, Kurios, is used for God, Yahweh. It's the same word used for a human Lord as well in the Greek New Testament. In the Hebrew, they make a distinction, so there's no confusion. They use the name Yahweh, which they forbid to be spoken. They use Adonai or Hashem in its place, but it's referring to the Yud-He Vav-He God. And when it's human Lord, they use Adon, which means human Lord, like Sarah considered Abraham her husband, her Adon, her Lord. So there's no distinction. There is a distinction. There's no confusion about who it's referring to. So anyway, the light shone about him, and he says, "Who are you? Who are you, Lord?" And someone from the clouds spoke to him and said, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting." In 9, the person says, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting." In 22 and 26, he claims that Jesus not only said, "It's me that you're persecuting," but he also said, "It is hard for you to kick against the ox goad," or the pricks in some translation. Now, he's claiming Jesus used that expression. Lo and behold, when you look into that expression, it is hard for you to kick against the ox goads. That is actually a pagan, Greek pagan play expression about Dionysus, the god Dionysus, who's the son of Zeus. There was a play called Euripides by Bacchae, B-A-C-C-H-A-E, where Dionysus says, "Why are you kicking against the ox goads?" Now, I mentioned that just to have a point of reference, that he's claiming that Jesus is quoting the expression from a pagan god play that was very well known at that time. I find that hard to believe, that Jesus would use an expression of a pagan god. That's the first red flag. Well, that's the high priest and the warrant and all that is the first, but this is another red flag. So many red flags in his road to Damascus conversion story. But moving along, so there's 3 different accounts, like I said, in chapter 9, 22, and 26. And in one account, the men heard the voice Another account, they didn't hear the voice. So there's a lot of contradictions when he's repeating the story. So I don't dwell on them type of contradictions because people try to explain it away. Oh, the word heard really meant understood. So they heard a sound, but they didn't really understand, what was being said. And so that's why they didn't really understand. That's why it says in one account they heard the voice, and the next account they said they didn't hear the voice. But I don't make a big deal out of those contradictions, but there are definitely contradictions there to his story. In Daniel, where was it? I think Daniel 10:15. I have to double check it. When Daniel had a vision and the men with him did not see the vision that Daniel saw, even though the men were with him, but they said they ran into a cave. That's why they didn't see the vision or hear anything. But there's no indication that the men with Saul was with Saul. They didn't run and hide when they hear the sound and saw the lightning flashing or the light flashing or anything. They were right with him, but yet there's no witnesses. There's no account in any historical records, any biblical, even in the Bible, even by Luke. There's no information or account from the people that were with him. I would like to know, did they get converted also, or did they continue persecuting Christians? I think that's very relevant. And if Luke is writing this to Theophilus for his trial with Emperor Nero, I think that would be pertinent information. Wouldn't you want some witnesses to be able to say, here's my witness that this is what happened and I got converted? No account at all of any witnesses that were with Paul can validate what he was saying on the road to Damascus. There's a few secondhand witnesses like Ananias, but we're going to get to that in a second. It's next. But no firsthand witnesses. So he said, okay, here it is. The next contradiction, this is about like 3 or 4. I'm going so fast. He said, get up, go into the city, and you will be told what you have to do. When he asks, what should I do, sir? And he says that Jesus told him, go into Damascus and you'll find out what you have to do. He repeated that same charge in chapter 22, Acts. But in Acts 26, he said, Jesus gave him a laundry list of instructions right on the road to Damascus of what he should do. And so he didn't say that, no, I'll tell you when you get to Damascus. He told him everything in chapter 26. We're going to get to that as well. But that's another contradiction in this story. So here it is. Daniel 10:7, by the way, is the scripture with Daniel's men. I'm mentioning the scriptures so you can pause the video and review what I'm saying also. So the men stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. So they helped Saul off the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So Paul was blinded, and Christians would say he was blinded by Jesus. We used to watch a Bible movie when I was younger about Paul saying, Jesus blinded me. I know it's, theatrical, it's not necessarily biblical, but that's how Christians believe, that Jesus blinded Saul of Tarsus in order to get him to convert. I mean, I've never heard of God or Jesus blinding someone in order to get them to convert. That's not the nature of God. That is not the nature of Jesus. I'm sorry. Let's just put that out there. It's very, I won't even say unlikely, with all due respect. I say it's borderline impossible. That would never happen, that God blinded you to get you to convert. So there are instances in the Bible where people were blinded. Like, for example, Lot, the 2 angels that were with Lot, they blinded the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because they were wanting they were attempting in the act of committing a sodomy rape and sodomy. And so, in order to escape, they had to blind them, the men, so that they couldn't see, because they were about to charge Lot's door and rape the two angels that came to visit Lot. So, that was like a defensive measure. It wasn't to get them to convert and obey the Torah or anything like that. They simply, it was an act of violence. The other instances in the Bible, why I find it hard to believe, that Jesus would blind anyone, were all like wicked people. Judges, Samson was blinded by the Philistines. Zedekiah, the king, he was blinded by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar also killed his 7 sons. This is 2 Kings 25:7. Samson is Judges 16:21, if you want to look it up for yourself. King Nahash, who was David's mother's first husband. Psalm 51, long story. I'm not going to get into it now. But when he said, I was born in sin and shaped in iniquity, he was referring to the fact that his mother was married to a Moabite king, and they never got legally divorced. And so when she remarried Jesse, it was without the get, the certificate of divorce. So that's why David said, I was born in sin and shaped in iniquity, Psalm 51:5. But that's another teaching. But the fact is, Nahash blinded Jabesh Gilead, the people of Jabesh Gilead. Whenever he conquered the territory, if you wanted to make peace or surrender, one of the conditions of peace was that he would have to blind you. I don't remember if it's in one of your eyes or both of your eyes, but that was a condition of peace. He was a wicked Moabite king. And the namesake, King Saul, had to rout him, give him licks, send him back, and I think killed him later on. That's 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. Now, there is one instance in the curses of Deuteronomy 28:28, where God says, I will curse you with blindness, insanity, and confusion. Again, Deuteronomy 28:28. And so that basically is a blindness if you're not keeping the Torah. He doesn't blind you to convert, but this is, as a matter of fact, I'll go a step further. There's also a debate about whether this is physical blindness or if it's referring to like he making you dunce. Because the next verse, he says, you will walk around during the day as a blind person who stumbles at night. So it more pertains to the insanity. That's the blindness. It's a spiritual blindness. But even if someone says it's a physical blindness God was referring to, it's still for not keeping the Torah. It's a curse. And, Paul's whole ministry was about not keeping the Torah. And so many people would try to make a correlation and say, well, God had punished, Saul of Tarsus for persecuting the Christians. But Paul didn't even feel like he did anything wrong in persecuting the Christians. When he told, I think Philippians chapter 3, verse 6, that he was keeping the Torah, and when he was persecuting the Christians, he felt he was even blameless. Blameless was the word that he used. So he felt innocent from what he was doing, like he was doing the right thing. So therefore, it shows that not once, please, anyone, I beg you can show me, comment in the video, once where Paul repented of persecuting the church and being the Antichrist. I have not seen, and I looked to give him the benefit of the doubt, not once did he ever repent or ever said he repented. He said the opposite, that he was blameless. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus was healing the blind man in John chapter 9. And he even said, he did it for the glory of God, And so his ministry was all about healing the blind. And I'll get into that from Isaiah's prophecy and so forth in a second. But I want to fast forward. I don't want to spend all the time on the concept of blindness, but that's important. There is one instance in the New Testament where someone was blinded. Guess who did the blinding? Saul of Tarsus himself. He blinded someone. Not Jesus, not God. Saul of Tarsus blinded Bar Jesus. Elymas. Acts chapter 13, verse 11 to 12. I think from verse 6. They were meeting before Governor Sergius Paulus, and Elymas, Bar Jesus is his other name, was opposing Saul, and Paul didn't like it. And he struck him with blindness. He had his sorcery power. I call it sorcery, because him blinding someone, that's not of God, for one. And for two, he blinded someone for opposing him, for disagreeing him with, for debating him. They had an audience before Governor Sergius Paulus, and because Paul didn't want to debate him or felt offended that he would even disagree with him, he was very, bully is not even a appropriate word. It's not even scratch the surface. He was the type of person, basically, he blinded you if you disagreed with him. That's what it comes down to. So he's the only one in the New Testament that blinded someone. So to claim that Jesus blinded him, I'm sorry. People got to come better than that. So anyway, now there's spiritual blindness, that I could understand. But Jesus said he came, Isaiah 61, verse 1 and 2. Isaiah 6, 9 and 10. Isaiah 42, verse 6 and 7. There's spiritual blindness where people have eyes, but they can't see, ears, but they can't hear, because they're stubborn. Their hearts were hard, and so God hardened Pharaoh's heart, like he hardened Pharaoh's heart. And Jesus left them to their own stubbornness, resistance to the gospel. But, when John the Baptist was in prison, and he said, he had a little bit of doubt. His faith was a little bit shaky at that point. And so he asked Jesus, hold on one second. Yeah, John the Baptist asked Jesus, he said, are you the one to come? I'm in prison. I mean, am I on the right path here? And Jesus said, look at what's going on. The blind are being healed, and people are being restored, and demons are being cast out, and so that was his confirmation that he was the Messiah. So there's many other examples. I won't get into it, but as far as blindness, Saul, whatever you want to call him, he said Israel was blinded. Why? For keeping the Torah. In Romans 11:7, Romans 11:25, he said Israel is partially blinded until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. So he's basically saying they're stupid. They don't know what's up. And so until my ministry with the Gentiles blossoms, and then when I finish blossoming to the Gentiles, then Israel would come in. And he even quoted Isaiah 59:20 to support what he was saying when he was saying the Redeemer will come to Jacob and turn away ungodliness from Jacob. But that's not what Isaiah said. Isaiah said the opposite. Isaiah said the Redeemer will come to Jacob when Jacob has turned from their ungodliness. Paul twisted around. I hope you know this. Rewind what I'm saying so you can play it back and see the difference. Paul reversed it. He said something really interesting. He said in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 14 to 16, he said that Israel is blinded whenever they read Moses' Torah. You think about what I'm saying and check it yourself and see if I'm quoting it correctly. 2 Corinthians 3, verses 14 to 16. Whenever they read the Torah, they're blinded. They have a veil that covers them whenever they read. The Torah it's like a veil. Like they can't see. He said some of the stupidest things imaginable. You can't even believe. And Christians You know, my brothers, my sisters, Christians, they just accept whatever Paul says. It must be true if he said it, you know? That whenever Moses is read, this is what happens when you try to read the Torah. And as soon as you stop reading the Torah, then the veil is lifted. You know, that's not what happened with Moses' veil. Because of the glory of Moses' face, that's why he had a veil. And Paul misapplied that and perverted it into trying to say they're veiled whenever they're reading the Torah. He said, the God of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4, will blind people who disagrees with Paul. Now, the expression, the God of this world, some people say he was referring to Satan, calling Satan the God of this world. Others say, no, it wasn't referring to Satan. That's an assumption. I'm not going to take a position on either one, but either way, he's trying to say God blinds people who disagrees with him. Yeah, he even said so in his prophecy in 1 Thessalonians, in the book of Thessalonians, he said God will send them a strong delusion. God is deluding people. That's what he said. People read that and accept it and digest it and without swallowing, without chewing, and they just accept it. They never really think about what exactly he's saying. Jesus himself says, blind Pharisees. He called them blind because they were sanctifying, in Matthew 23:26, they were sanctifying the gold in the temple rather than he who sanctifies the gold in the temple. Same thing with the tithes. And also Matthew 15, verses 1 to 14, especially 1 and 14. He called them blind Pharisees because they was making a big deal out of the Entalat Yadayim, the hand-washing ceremony. Oh, why your disciples not eating with unwashed hands? And people also take that and pervert it in the book of Mark and say Jesus he cleansed unclean meat, so now it's okay to eat pork. So there's a lot of, crazy doctrines that people like to pervert. And, some of it comes from this guy right here, claiming that Jesus blinded him. So let's move on from blindness. So for 3 days, he couldn't see. And there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias, mentioned also in chapter 22, verse 12. And so in a vision, Jesus said to Ananias, this is Paul's witness, according to Luke, Ananias, he said, here I am. Yes, Lord. Get up and go to Straight Street to Judas's house and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. He's praying there. Now, first of all, again, did you catch that? Judas's house. Now, we know of a Judas in the Bible that betrayed Jesus. Whether or not this was the same Jesus, I'll break it down real quick. There are 7 Judases in the Bible. If you go through Strong's Concordance, James Strong's Concordance on Judas, you'll see that he doesn't believe that this Judas is the same Judas that betrayed Jesus. But he lists this Judas separate with no reference to him, which indicates that he did not know who this Judas was, that Saul went to this person's house. So therefore, he couldn't say it was the Judas in the Bible that betrayed Jesus, or it wasn't. So that's another point to consider. It's a little bit more of a coincidence that Saul would go to Judas's house. I know Judas was from Kiryat. Judas Iscariot was his name. The Kiryat was the place where he was found from, like Jesus of Nazareth, Judas from Iscariot. So he wasn't in Damascus, but that's not to say he couldn't have a house in Damascus or a family in Damascus. But anyway, I'm not speculating. I'm going to leave that as a question mark. So Ananias went there, and he had a vision. He said Saul has a vision of someone coming and restoring his sight. So Ananias, in his vision of his discussion with Jesus, said, many have told me about this man, how much harm he has done to your people in Jerusalem. And here, look, he has a warrant, authority from the high priest to arrest everyone who calls on your name. So, another question. How would Ananias know that Saul of Tarsus had a warrant to arrest people in Damascus? Because this was a top secret mission, right? Wasn't it supposed to be a top secret mission from the high priest? So how would Ananias know? People tend to say, oh, well, Jesus revealed it to him. No, sorry, it's the opposite. Ananias is the one telling Jesus about it. Of course, Jesus, if that was Jesus, which I don't believe it was, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. Or maybe, as we continue, because that's the whole purpose of, reviewing the book of Acts. But Ananias was telling this Jesus that Saul of Tarsus had a warrant. So how would Ananias know? Now, we know Saul of Tarsus told his story later on in chapters 9, 22, and 26 that he had a warrant. That's another thing. How come the Sanhedrin didn't investigate the high priest to see, if he actually had a warrant? No historical records indicate that he did. But anyway, Ananias is telling Jesus that he has a warrant. Top secret information that Ananias knows already, because there's no indication that he bounced him up and he heard the stories and it was propagated and so forth. Maybe later on in the chapter, I'll show you where. But at this point, there is no indication. So he's saying that he has a warrant and he's coming to persecute the people in Damascus. And so Jesus said to him, he is my chosen vessel, instrument to carry my name to the Gentiles, the Goyim, even to their kings and to the sons of Israel as well. So we know if Jesus was telling Ananias that Saul of Tarsus was chosen to carry the name of Jesus to the sons of Israel and the Gentiles, then Saul himself forsook that mission twice in Acts 13, verse 46. When he went to the Jews in one city, they rejected him, and he said, forget you Jews, I'm going to the Gentiles now. He did it twice. So obviously, if Jesus was telling Ananias that Saul was supposed to carry the ministry to the Jews too, Saul forsook that once he see that they rejected his false doctrine, his desire to have Jews not be circumcised. Acts 21:21, things we're going to get to, all the stuff, all his epistles, it's all there. All the evidence is right here in black and white of how he was against the Torah. And we're going to get to all of that, but it's not something I'm just saying off the top of my head. It's all documented. So that's a second point that questions the witness's account of Ananias, because Ananias, so that tells me that Ananias could not have known he had a warrant at that time. And therefore, Luke was reverse engineering, writing things back that didn't happen at the time, but later on, these were the discussions that were had between him and Paul, and that's what they put back into the text. Because there's no way Ananias knew Paul had a warrant if it was top secret. So anyway, he went on and he said, Brother Saul, the Jesus who appeared to you on the road to Damascus has sent me to you. Again, how did he know Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus? He's telling Saul the Jesus who appeared to you. There's no record there's no account, there's no statement by Jesus that said I appeared to him on the road to Damascus. So that obviously tells me that Luke reverse engineered and wrote back into the scriptures things from the discussion he had with Saul of Tarsus. So, but anyway, that's one witness claim. You know, the Bible says by the mouth of two or three shall a thing be established. So, you know, one witness claim with a lot of holes in his testimony does not validate Saul of Tarsus. And certainly the men writing with him, no witness accounts of that as well. So in that moment, scales fell from his eyes and he could see again, and he got up and got baptized. And, you know, funny that he got baptized, but later on he said Jesus didn't send him to baptize. You know, I thought that was hilarious, that he would disown the covenant of baptism with a false humility, how he did it. So some days later, this is in verse 20, some days later with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began proclaiming in the synagogue that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, this is what got Barnabas to take him under his wing and vouch for him. Otherwise, nobody would have believed anything about him. So now I could understand some days later in verse 20 that Paul began preaching, you know, this is what happened, this is my conversion. But the witnessing with Ananias was before that, some days later. So there's no way he would have known those details as yet. So continuing along, Saul was filled with more and more power. I wouldn't say it was the power from God, like Isaiah 9:6, the might of God, which is translated mighty God, El Gibor, the power of God. But he got power. Where he got that from, we're going to leave that question open right now. I already kind of gave you an example that in Acts 13, when he was blinding people. So that is not the power from God. As a matter of fact, you know what? I'm gonna throw it out there. In 1 second, the next verse, I'm gonna get to it. So he says the Grecian Jews, non-believing Jews in Damascus, found out he was there, and he switched teams according to them, and so they were watching the gates day and night to kill him, right? And so under the cover of night, they took him and let him down a basket on the city wall. Now, look at what he said. This is Luke now writing to Theophilus to defend Paul against the Jews who arrested him. And he tells Luke that it's the Jews, the Grecian Jews, non-believing Jews in my translation, in verse 23, who would try to capture him and kill him. But listen to his lie. He contradicted himself in Galatians 1:17. Hold on. It could be 2 Corinthians 11:33. Let me just double check. Sorry. Acts, Romans, Corinthians. 1 second. Yes, I had to double check because I had in my notes 2 different scriptures pertaining to this topic. So it's actually 2 Corinthians 11:33. This is his lie. Actually, he lied to Luke. He told the truth to the Corinthians. But the contradiction is in 2 Corinthians 11:33. To save time, I wanted to turn to it first. He said, this is the same account when he was in Damascus. The governor under King Aretas had the city under guard in order to arrest me, but I was lowered in the basket through an opening in the wall and escaped his clutches. He told the Corinthian church that it was the governor under King Aretas in Damascus that tried to capture him. He told Luke it was the Grecian Jews who tried to capture him. You see his lie, his contradiction? Because he wanted to implicate the Jews to Theophilus, because the Jews are the ones who arrested him. But to the Corinthian church, he told them the truth. It was the governor under King Aretas. Now the question, why the lie? Or more importantly, remember what I just said about if he goes to Damascus? That's a international terrorism act to go trying to kidnap Damascus Christian citizens and take them back to Israel, a foreign country. That tells you that the governor in Damascus don't play that. You can't come to Damascus to try to kidnap Christians, Jews, Muslims, not Muslims, but you know what I mean, anybody for that matter, Damascus citizens. And so that was an illegal act, and it's impossible that the high priest would give him anything in writing to go do such a treacherous illegal act that could implicate the high priest himself, and the high priest could be stoned for that. But he told the Corinthian church, the truth, that it was Governor Aretas who tried to kidnap him. He wasn't going to tell that to Nero, because if Nero found out that the king Aretas of Syria, Damascus, was actually out to capture Paul, can you imagine? Nero would have chopped his head off or extradited him to Syria to stand trial in Syria as well. So he did not want to confess that it was actually the governor of King Aretas in Damascus was the one trying to capture him. That's why he lied to Luke and told Luke it was the Grecian Jews who tried to capture him. Look it up for yourself. Acts chapter 9, verse 23, versus 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 33. Okay, so continuing along, he told Luke that, I think another way he says, many days later, he went to Jerusalem and tried to join the disciples in Jerusalem. Another lie. You see how many lies? I've probably had about 8 lies already so far in just this one chapter. Here's the lie. On verse 26, on reaching Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. That part is true. But look, Galatians 1:17. Galatians 1:17. Quickly. So he said, I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. Instead, I immediately went off to Arabia and afterwards returned to Damascus. Not until 3 years later did I go up to Jerusalem to meet Peter, and I stayed with him for 2 weeks, but I did not see any of the other apostles except James. James wasn't an apostle, so obviously he didn't know who the apostles were, even though he was the one claiming he was an apostle. And he did not meet any apostles except James. And the Lord's brother. I'm laughing because the next comment in verse 20, he says, concerning these matters I am writing to you about, I declare before God with my right hand on the Bible, I am not lying. You notice he had to say, I'm not lying, because he lied to Luke. He didn't lie to the Galatians church, but he lied to Luke and told Luke he went to Jerusalem after Damascus, but he told the Galatians he went to Arabia, because he was always telling the Gentiles that the apostles, he got nothing from them. He didn't learn from them. He learned from Jesus in his mystical visions. And so they didn't teach him anything about Jesus that he needed to know. So he was always, bashing and bad-mouthing that he didn't need to learn anything from the true apostles and James. So therefore, so he told Galatians that he went to Arabia for 3 years. that Jesus called him on the road to Damascus. And what did he do? He disappeared for 3 years. That's what he told the truth to the Galatian church. I can tell you when there's a contradiction. I can tell you which one is the truth and which one is the lie, because I know the context of the whole story. Okay? Praise be God. So I studied it. I researched it. That's why. So he went to Arabia for 3 years, and he didn't go back to Jerusalem until 3 years later. But he told Luke in 9:26 that many days later, he went to Jerusalem. So let's continue with Luke. By the way, he went to Arabia. I'm going to drop it now because I might as well. I'm going to get to it, but I might as well just plant the seed now, and I'll defend it as we go along. I'm going to make a bold statement right now. He went to Arabia for 3 years to learn sorcery. That's what he was doing. A lot of Christian pastors and theologians like to say, oh, he went to Arabia to learn from Jesus, and he was praying, and he took a sabbatical, and he was, doing this and that. None of the above. There's no historical records in the Bible or biblical records of what he was doing in Arabia for 3 years when Jesus supposedly Jesus supposedly called him. Instead of saying, okay, I was called, let me go now and start preaching the word. No, he disappeared for 3 years. And I'm going to tell you this. He went to learn sorcery from the Nabatean gypsies in Arabia. The gypsies are the ones that you see a lot of them today. They're famous in the circus. They perform a lot of magical acts. They are contortionists. They do a lot of magical stuff. That's why they're very, very popular in circus acts. They do all that circus illusions and stuff like that, magic tricks and stuff like that. That's what Saul of Tarsus went to learn in Arabia from the Nabatean gypsies. I'm going to show it to you as we go along. From our extra sources, okay? So those silent years, they weren't silent to me, okay? I researched it. So now, he lied to Luke and told him he went to Jerusalem, which was a lie, many days later. He didn't go until, 3 years later, as he told Galatians 1:17. And so, when he got to Damascus, he was speaking boldly in the name of Jesus, which of course he did, but he was speaking a false doctrine, faith without works and no circumcision, and that's why they rejected him. And that's why he said, I'm going on to the Gentiles now. But anyway, by the way, the Christians in Damascus were scattered to Damascus because of Paul himself. Remember when they were in Acts chapter 8, when he was persecuting the church? And they said Damascus fled, the disciples fled Jerusalem. Only the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. But most of the disciples fled Jerusalem and were scattered, and they went into the diaspora. And so he was going after those diaspora Christians, by the way. I forgot to mention that. So all the irony is coming full circle. So they made a plot to kill him. And so, again, he's saying the Jews were making a plot to kill him. And that's when they sent him away to Tarsus. So, the church in Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed peace and was built up. They lived in the fear of the Lord and the counsel of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and they kept multiplying. But now it comes into Peter. Peter traveled and went down was healing people. It's a mention of Peter healing people and made them turn to the Lord. And there was a girl named Tabitha, which means gazelle, interpreted Dorcas, and she was doing tzedakah or charity or acts of righteousness, however you want to translate it. Remember Paul, I think in Romans 3:10, 3:20, 3:10, he said there are none righteous, which is a lot of baloney. There are many righteous. But he tried to say, that keeping the Torah won't make you righteous and all of that type of stuff. He perverted a lot of texts. I think it was Psalms that he was quoting, which were talking about atheistic unbelievers, and of those people there were none righteous. Not that there are none righteous in the whole earth. But Paul perverted it and extrapolated it and said, no, not one. Not one person is righteous. So many righteous. Even in the New Testament, Zacharias, Jesus himself, Elizabeth, and this girl Dorcas. So Peter was healing her. She kneeled down and prayed, and so forth and so on. So it ends chapter 9 with Peter healing Dorcas. Okay, it kind of just shifted from Paul to Peter, but nevertheless, the majority of the context was about Paul. And so, let me just review. Here it is. Here it is. Verse 27. This is it. What I said earlier. Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles, the other apostles, and said how Paul had seen the Lord Jesus while traveling. So now, that appears to be the story that Paul gave, because in verse 23, this is still chapter 9 of Acts, it says, quite some time later. So obviously there were time that Paul spent, and in verse 20, it says, Saul spent many days with the disciples in Damascus. So obviously, quite some time later, many days later, Paul was actually telling them what happened. Barnabas believed him. Secondhand information, Barnabas wasn't there. His traveling companion, hoodlums that was with him, none of them testified or anything before the Sanhedrin in Acts 26, in Acts 22, or before Governor Felix in Acts 26. None of them testified. So Barnabas took him, heard him proclaiming Jesus, even though it was a false doctrine. But the fact that, he was even proclaiming Jesus, that's a big thing, because rather a false Jesus than persecuting Jesus. And so he took them and, vouched for him, say, listen, give the man a chance, And so we're going to go on to stories how Paul used Barnabas and, and kicked him out. In Acts chapter 15, when he had a big fight with Barnabas, and because Barnabas wanted to take his nephew, John Mark, the writer of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, because Mark saw Paul practicing sorcery, the same sorcery that, blinding Bar Jesus in Acts 13. Mark saw it and said, no, this man is practicing sorcery. That's not good. Mark went back to Jerusalem to tell James about what he saw Saul was doing. And a lot of Christians like to throw Mark under the bus. John Mark is his name. The writer of the Gospel of Mark, they throw him under the bus. They say Mark abandoned Paul because the missionary journey was rough, and he was scared, and he was a coward, and he was a punk, and all of that. And they try to throw him under the bus by saying, look how he left Paul. But he left Paul because he saw Paul practicing sorcery. The same sorcery he learned from the Arabian Nabateans, gypsies, when he went 3 years to Arabia. And so when Barnabas basically took Paul and said, listen, I want to keep Mark with us. That's my nephew. He's a good, he's a good guy. Just because he disagreed with what you were doing, that's no reason to, not take him with us again on our second journey. And Paul said, nope. Somebody who's snitching on me, I don't want him around me. Paul did not want John Mark around him because John Mark snitched on Paul and went back and told James about Paul's sorcery. Many Christians don't even know none of this. None of this. I'm not boasting or anything. I'm just speaking the truth. They don't know none of this. The context of what happened and why things was happening. So that's one time. A second time, Paul threw Barnabas under the bus. In Galatians 2, when he accused Peter, he tried to throw Peter under the bus too. He accused Peter of not eating meat sacrificed to idols. That's what it was all about. And Peter's, because Paul, we're going to get to it in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. And one of the prohibitions was eating meat sacrificed to idol. But just to reference Barnabas, that Paul cursed out Peter and wrote the church in Galatians, all the way in Galatians, to tell him how bad Paul was, how tough he was, because he cursed out Peter to his face for him eating, being a hypocrite, because he wouldn't eat with the Gentiles. And so Barnabas actually agreed with Peter. When you read Galatians chapter 2, read the account of what happened with Barnabas, that Barnabas actually agreed with Peter, that Peter was not supposed to eat meat sacrificed to idol. But we don't read the Clementine homilies. We don't know the other side of the story. So all we know is what Paul said, what Paul told Luke. I'm sorry, he didn't tell Luke. He told the Galatian church of how Peter was in the wrong, and Peter was condemned, and Peter was a hypocrite. But the truth of the matter is Paul was the hypocrite, because he agreed in Acts 15 not to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And then he, in 1 Corinthians 9 and 11, he wrote that it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And then when Peter wouldn't agree with it, he cursed out Peter. And even in Galatians chapter 2, verse 13, he says, Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. He's saying Barnabas was a hypocrite too. The same Barnabas that vouched for Paul. If there was no Barnabas, there would be no Paul. In Acts chapter 9, Barnabas took him and said, give the man a chance. And Paul called Barnabas a hypocrite for agreeing with Peter. So those are the two references to Paul and Barnabas. There's others, many others, but I'm going to get into those as we continue. But that's it for chapter 9. So basically, that's why I don't believe Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, because it don't line up. There's a lot of contradictions. Even the doctrine that he said Jesus taught him in all his visions, he was having visions and trances and stuff like that. One of his trances was in the temple. Even he was having what they call it? It's a drug, ecstasy. The name trance, the word trance is actually the Greek word ecstasia, like the drug ecstasy. That drug-induced feeling, that's what Paul was experiencing when he claimed he met Jesus. And the entity in the trance does not tell you anything good. Same thing with Peter was in ecstasy. He was in a trance, and the voice told him to eat unclean meat. 3 times tempted him, not of God. God doesn't tell you to eat unclean meat, doesn't tempt you to eat unclean meat. And so that ecstasy that Paul was in, that and I'm going to get into what he said Jesus, told him to do and so forth and so on, why it's not Jesus. But there's no way that could have been Jesus that Paul believed. And you know something? Nobody, Christianity, no one ever questions if that was really Jesus that Paul met on the road to Damascus. There's the lost books of the Bible. The first book of Adam and Eve. It's part of the Lost Books series. It's Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, whatever it is. I'm not saying that I accept those books as anointed or anything. Neither do I accept the epistles either, so we even. But it has examples of Satan appearing as an entity to Adam and Eve, to tempt Adam and Eve. These are stories outside of Genesis. And so it just goes to show that whether you believe it or not, the fact is that Satan actually can appear and claim and masquerade. Paul himself even know that. He says Satan masquerades as an angel of light and his ministers as ministers of righteousness. So Paul himself even know that, but not once did he ever stop to question that entity that told him to go preach a false gospel, where he got his whole ministry from. And so that's why I question the whole road to Damascus conversion account. And, you know, there's too many lies. I pointed out, please repeat the video and count. You can probably count about 12 lies in this one chapter alone, this one account. And so there's no way that I believe that Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus. So too many lies. All right, on that note, I'm going to sum up chapter 9. How long was that? An hour, almost an hour. Just an hour exactly. So I don't want to go over too much more. There's a lot more I could say, but that's it for now. Thank you. God bless.